daughter and son-in-law moved to Birmingham. Son does. Yeah. And then the son, they still in the dog range. Oh yeah, that's who was talking about the dog food. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, and his wife, retired from Fulton County. And I think they involved in dogs, so people farm. They can't even make it happen. And I knew Jimmy Beck, they had the big relationship. How you doing? Good. Good. Your wife, Becky? Only time you look, there's no spot, you know that. Oh, yeah, that's what's like fun. Oh, yeah, that's Christmas time.
There we go. Well, good evening, everybody. Glad you're here. Appreciate you being here. Those of you visiting, thank you for being here. What makes teamwork work? We talked about teamwork last night a little bit. The quote there from Numbers chapter 13, verse 30 is the words of Caleb back in the days that the children of Israel under Moses' leadership came to the border of the promised land at Kadesh Barnea and sent in the 12 spies that the kids just sang about. And they came back out with glowing reports of the goodness of the land. And of course, we know what happened. 10 were bad and 2 were good. And the people listened to the 10 bad ones instead of the 2 good ones. Caleb, though, the other of the two good spies, said, let's go get it. Let's go get what God has promised to us. And the focus of what we'll talk about tonight is one of the qualities that makes teamwork work. And the biblical background for our discussion, for our study, is Joshua chapters 5 and 6. So you might want to take your Bible and open that to Joshua chapters 5 and 6. And before Joshua is finished as the leader of God's people, he's going to have led them through a total of 31 victories, 31 conquests over the different nations and nation states and peoples represented under the umbrella of the Canaanites in the Promised Land, possessing the land that God had promised so long before, 400 plus years before, to Abraham. That had to begin with the devotion of Jericho. Now, we'll see a little bit about that in chapter 6. We'll talk about that in a little while. But a little bit of background. Your translation may describe Jericho as accursed or devoted, any word like that. Some translations might say consecrated, cursed. The thing that we need to understand is what those English words are translating from that Greek or that Hebrew word. And that word for devotion or cursed means God claimed that as his. It was basically the first fruits of the promised land. They'd been wandering in the wilderness for 40 years. You have a whole generation of military-aged men, for example, who had been born since they came out of Egyptian slavery. Some of them had never seen Egypt. And they've heard all their lives, God's going to give us this land. God's going to give us this land. This is a great land. And they've seen God taking care of them as they've wandered. They've seen the faithless generation dying off, and they've kept going and grumbled and complained and had the consequences of that from time to time. And now they're ready to go in and actually get what God promised. Now, what does a child do on a birthday or on Christmas when they have been hoping for one specific particular present, and they see that box or that bag or whatnot that looks like it might be that one thing? Boy, they're just quivering with excitement, aren't they? And they can't wait to get to that one thing. And so what do mean old parents do? No, we make them wait their turn. No, you have to open this one first, or what have you. Think about that movie, The Christmas Story, where Ralphie wants the Red Ryder BB gun, and he goes through all the Christmas gifts Christmas morning, and there's no Red Ryder BB gun. And finally Dad kind of points him over behind the Christmas tree, by the desk, sandwiched next to the wall, and there's one more present, long, skinny box. And you can see he's just about to explode with excitement when he realizes what it is. That's where Israel is when they come to Gilgal. They come across the Jordan River. They're in the plains of Gilgal. Here's the whole land spread out before them. Let's go get it. God's been promising it to us all these years. It's time. And God says, hold on a minute. There's some things you need to understand and some things you need to do first. And one of the things you need to understand is this particular city, this is mine. You need to understand sacrifice, first fruits. That's what this is. The other places that they would capture, the other cities, the other fortresses, the other communities and towns, all of those, they would be preserved so that they could use them. Houses that you didn't build, fields you didn't plant, vineyards that you didn't tend. But Jericho, no. I'm going to I'm going to devote that to me, God says. And in chapter 6 at verse 26, Joshua pronounces a curse on the ruins of Jericho. Anybody that tries to rebuild this city, it'll cost him the lives of his firstborn and his youngest child. And then you go over to 1 Kings chapter 16 and verse 34, and hundreds of years later along comes a fellow named Hiel the Bethelite. And you have to wonder, what was this guy thinking? Was he just that ignorant of history, or did he not believe, or what? But he starts to rebuild the city, and it costs him his firstborn child and his youngest child. Now, there are a couple of important things to remember about what Israel begins to do here. From the outside looking in, we see a whole nation of people, 600,000 soldiers, going in and just tearing up the place. And the hypercritical 21st century attitude is, well, the Israelites were guilty of genocide. But there's some things we need to understand. The people in these cities, the Canaanite peoples, were not innocent people. They had been judged guilty of sin by God, guilty of idolatry and other sins. Israel was not going into the promised land to wage war for themselves. They were, in effect, God's sword of judgment against these idol-worshiping, sexually immoral, child-sacrificing people. People who were without excuse. And God's judgment of them was not hasty. It had been 500 years in the making. It was not arbitrary. The Israelites themselves were hardly pure and perfect as the wind-driven snow, as they say. These people had been under judgment for hundreds of years, but God had stayed his wrath through this time. When God promised that land to Abraham hundreds of years before, back in Genesis chapter 15, verse 16, he said the sins of the Amorites were not complete. They weren't full. He saw which way they were going, but he said, it's not time yet. It would take the whole time that Israel was in slavery in Egypt before God was ready to bring judgment that those nations deserved. And that proves God's patience in administering justice. They had all those years, they had an opportunity to back off to try to turn things around, and they just plowed on ahead in sin. Now, the Lord's judgment of these Canaanite people is specific, and it's based on his word. Remember, until Jacob comes on the scene, there are no Jews and Gentiles, are there? They're just people. Hebrews chapter 1 tells us that God at sundry times and in diverse manners spoke unto the patriarchs, the fathers, by the prophets. Now, the Hebrew, the Jew reading that, would think of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Jewish prophets, and understandably so. But who came before Abraham and Isaac and Jacob? You've got Noah and Adam way back there. You've got God dealing with people before there were Jews and Gentiles. And there was law and there was his word in those days. And when God separated out Israel's descendants to be their own nation, he didn't just ignore the whole rest of humanity. He continued to deal with them too, and we have evidence of that all through the Old Testament. But these people, the point is, these people, the Canaanites, were not unaware of their sins. They ignored God's will, and they may have been ignorant through the generations of God's will, but it wasn't that God hadn't revealed himself to them. He had. They just turned away from him. His judgment fulfills the words of Noah Back in Genesis chapter 9 in verses 25 and 26 and 27, Noah had cursed Canaan, the son of Ham, one of his own sons, because of his actions toward Noah. And these words are a fulfillment of that curse. And that also ends the judgment of Canaan in Joshua and Judges. Now, what happens here is not genocide, because there's nothing racial, nothing ethnic about it. Genocide would imply that God was playing favorites among people, opposing some nations and favoring others because of race or because of ethnicity or something like that, based on characteristics that God gave them. God's playing favorites because he made these people tall and these people short or whatever. And there's none of that here. As the Lord responds to Joshua in these chapters, he's neither for Israel or his enemies. God is for God. And the people, whether Jews or Gentiles, and Rahab will demonstrate this in chapter 7, 8, 9, God is for those who abide in faith. Rahab is a model of his mercy to the Gentile people. And in the same way, the Jews that died in the wilderness, the slave generation, the faithless generation that died in the wilderness, they testify to God's impartiality, his fairness toward Israel. In other words, when Israel sins, they get punished too, just like everybody else. And so we might call this holy warfare, but it's not genocide. The physical destruction that takes place, the death and slaughter and the burning of cities and so forth, that pales in comparison to eternal judgment, doesn't it? You think about that. Jesus will demolish the physical universe in the last day. And this pales by comparison to that. Now, that word for devoted, we talked about it a minute ago, it means belongs to God. The Hebrew word is cherem, and it means something that is devoted to someone, the specific property of someone, or it can mean put to destruction. Now, that's an idea, it's a concept that was actually very familiar to those people, the Canaanites and the Israelites alike, because the Canaanites were famous for conquering people and devoting them to their gods in slavery or in sacrifice. It was a common practice in the Near East, and you find references to that in 2 Kings chapter 19 and 2 Chronicles chapter 20, examples of that. What Israel was authorized to do, this is all background, so we'll get past this in just a minute. What Israel was authorized to do was not blanket destruction. It was limited to certain cities under specific conditions for one generation. God didn't say, go conquer this land and then just keep expanding and expanding and expanding and conquer everybody that you can. He said, here's your land. And he gave defined boundaries. And he said, here's why. And here's what you're authorized to do, and here's what you're not authorized to do. There is one exception, 1 Samuel chapter 15, that goes back to Numbers chapter 21. It's the Canaanites, though, if you look carefully in these early chapters of Joshua, it's the Canaanites who actually start the war, so to speak, initiate battle, and get together and plan to eradicate the Israelites. They're going to stamp them out if they can. On the other hand, what's the instruction given to Israel? Go back to Exodus chapter 23 and look at verse 31. And the instruction to Israel is not, you go in there and just wipe out everybody and every living thing. The instruction is drive them out. Drive them out. Now, if they won't drive, then you fight. But the whole point is, God said, I've given this land to Israel. And these people are being dispossessed because of their sins. They could, the Canaanites could have accepted that judgment and moved on. But they didn't. God used Israel to destroy the Canaanite peoples because of their idolatry and because of their profoundly evil behavior. You find numerous examples of that, child sacrifice and so forth, throughout the early books of the Old Testament, Genesis and Leviticus chapter 18, for example. That in turn would have the effect of weakening the Israelites if they left them there. You look at Deuteronomy chapter 20 and verses 17 and 18, and Moses is telling this new generation of Israelites, you need to beware of these people. Be careful and don't let them influence you to follow their examples. Well, once they get into the promised land, what happens? That's exactly what they do. They let the remaining Canaanites corrupt them. Now, if captives and property were devoted to the service of the Lord in this course of battle and conflict, there's no real economic incentive, no real economic basis for the Israelites to go in and wage war, is there? If what we're going to do is take these people and devote them to the Lord, they're not going to be our property. If we're going to take this magnificent city and devote it to the Lord and it's going to be destroyed, we have no incentive in that other than faithfulness to the Lord. Their motivation as God's people couldn't be racial superiority or some kind of nationalism like you might try to draw out of Deuteronomy chapter 9, because what do we see? God warns them over and over again. If you do in the land that I've promised you the things that these people have done, I'll do the same thing to you that I'm using you to do to them. Well, hundreds of years later, we get down to the time of Nebuchadnezzar, and what happens? They have corrupted the land. They have become vile and corrupt. And as Jeremiah would say, the land vomits them out because they did the very thing that God told them not to do. So now let's take our Bibles and look at Joshua chapter 5 and chapter 6 and try to draw out some lessons that we can apply. And the question, what makes teamwork work? Well, probably gathered from the skit a little while ago. The key there is selflessness, not shellfish. Selflessness. And we start in Joshua chapter 5 with the requirements that they had to fulfill before they could ever actually start possessing the land. You look at chapter 5 and there's a divine principle that's at work here. And it's an important principle. Over in Deuteronomy chapter 8, in verses 6 through 10, Moses had reminded them. Now remember, in the book of Deuteronomy, what's Moses doing? He's repeating basically everything that God had given them in the book of Exodus. That's what the name of the book means. Deutero, a second time, and nomos, nami, the law. It's a repetition of the law for a new generation. Some scholars call the book of Deuteronomy a 30-day revival. And we have two basic, long, detailed sermons from Moses to remind the people of their responsibilities. In chapter 8, starting at verse 6 and going down to verse 10, Moses says, "Therefore, you shall keep the commandments of the Lord your God, to walk in his ways and to fear him. For the Lord your God is bringing you into a good land, a land of brooks of water, of fountains and springs that flow out of valleys and hills, a land of wheat and barley, of vines and fig trees and pomegranates, a land of olive oil and honey, a land in which you will eat bread without scarcity, in which you will lack nothing, a land in whose stones are iron and out of whose hills you can dig copper. When you have eaten and are full, then you shall bless the Lord your God for the good land which he has given you. Three things that stand out in that statement. Number one, keep the commandments in verse 6. Why? Number two, in verse 7, because, that's what that word for means, because the Lord your God is doing this for you. And what's the response then? When you've eaten and you're full, you bless the Lord. You thank the Lord your God. In other words, remember who's making all of this possible. When God decreed that something had to be done, that something was required, something must be done, you know, we see this over and over, and we live in a generation where people think we're the exception to the rule. When God makes a decree, he says this is required, he never gives a waiver, does he? He never gives us an exception. Well, this is required, but you know, you're the exception to the rule. That's one of the foibles of a lot of false religions, is there's always an exempted class of people that don't have to follow the rules, as it were. Sometimes, though, obedience is very literally painful. You look at Joshua chapter 5, and what's the first thing that stands out here? You pick up at verse 2. At that time the Lord said to Joshua, make flint knives and circumcise the sons of Israel a second time. Ouch. Grown men. We're not talking about 8-day-old babies that wouldn't remember. We're talking about grown men that this is not going to be fun. Here's what you do. In this case, it's quite literally painful. And what do? Joshua did exactly what he was told to do. Now, the Lord acknowledged the completion of this requirement, this circumcision, with the words of verse 9. This day I have rolled away the reproach of Egypt from you. Therefore, the name of the place is called Gilgal to this day. Well, Gilgal, that word means a circle or a round, and it refers to the circle of stones that they placed there when they crossed the Jordan as a memorial of God's deliverance. And it comes from a Hebrew term that means to roll or to roll away. And it's the word for a wheel that comes from this root word as well, like a chariot wheel. Well, what's the reproach of Egypt that the Lord mentions here in verse 9? You go back to Genesis chapter 34, and in verse 14, the reproach would have been the shame, the disgrace of being uncircumcised. Back in Genesis 34, that was an issue that needed to be attended to. In Exodus chapter 32, in verse 12, Moses has to plead with God to spare Israel the taunts of the Egyptians for Israel failing to gain the promised land. That's where God says, I've had it, I'm done with these people. Moses, I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to wipe them out, and I'll just fulfill my promise through you. And Moses intercedes and says, no, because if you do this, the Egyptians will mock us. Well, there is a new significance then attached to this word Gilgal in this setting. It's not just a circle. Now, in the Israelites' minds, it's going to represent what God had done. What had God done there? Well, he rolled the waters of the Jordan River back so they could cross on dry ground when they went into the plains of Gilgal. You remember the priests take the Ark of the Covenant, they step down, the waters part, and just like the Red Sea, they come across on dry ground to go into the land. But it also reminds them of what they had to do there, what they had to do, this act of circumcision. It was an act of faith, an act of obedience. And it took some determination to go through with it. It symbolized their faith in what God said he would do to let them possess the land, that God would go before them. And it included this symbolism, this imagery includes their dedication to him, their commitment to him, to his purpose, and his commitment to them as his people. These two things, the mighty works of God and their response, their act of faith, these combine to roll away the reproach of Egypt. Now, at Gilgal, what are they doing? They're remembering not just the pain of the moment, but the covenant that goes all the way back to Abraham that this symbolizes. God's promises, his past deliverance, how he's taken care of them, fed them, and so forth all through these years. And this is a reminder so that we remember this and we commit ourselves, we dedicate ourselves to live as his people and possess the possession that he has promised us, to go in and take it just as he's promised that we can. So, in essence, what God is doing at Gilgal is he's saying, you want to be victorious? You want to win over the enemies in this land? You have to be a truly holy people. You have to do what it takes to be holy, and you have to trust me to fight your battles. Go back and look, how many times does God tell Moses particularly, I will fight for Israel? You know, the Israelites with 600,000 soldiers were a mighty army, and they had good leadership. Joshua was a smart general, but they could not have conquered the promised land on their own. They might have gotten a toehold on it, but they couldn't have taken everything that God promised to them, even with that big an army and that good a general. It was only possible because of the presence of God. To be victorious against the enemies of the land, you have to be a holy people and you have to trust me to fight your battles, God is saying. You have to trust my promises, my covenant that I've made with you, and you have to be committed to me as my people. Now, think about how Peter describes us over in 2 Peter. We are what kind of people? A people for God's own possession, a peculiar people. And that doesn't mean, well, from a worldly standpoint, it could mean weird or odd, but it means we're unique, dedicated to the Lord. Same concept as God is expressing to Joshua here. You have to remember your purpose, he's saying to them. What was their purpose in the world as a separate nation? Now, the Israelites tended to think of themselves, we're a separate nation, we're the only people God cares about. But you go back to Exodus chapter 19, look at verses 5 and 6, and what was the purpose God had given them? You're supposed to be a nation of priests. You're supposed to be the example, the light, the teachers, the influence, the salt in a sinful world, as it were. And Jesus draws on exactly that imagery in the Sermon on the Mount, salt and light in a sinful world. But that brings us in Joshua chapter 5. After they've done this, two more things happen. That brings us to the Passover. And this is only the third Passover that the people have kept. The first one was while they were in Egypt, the night before they leave. The second one was while they were at Mount Sinai the next year. And now it seems that for all the years of wandering in the wilderness, they haven't kept the Passover. But now they're going to. And it'll be at Gilgal as they're about to enter into the promised land. Why? Well, what does the Passover symbolize? Their deliverance, their preservation. The night that God slays the firstborn of all of Egypt, man and beast alike, wherever there's blood on the lintel and the doorposts, the lintel is the cross part over the door. Wherever there's blood, I'll pass over, I'll pass you by. remembering the past, remembering that God had taken care of them, remembering that God takes care of us. That's great preparation for the challenges and the tests of the future. So, the first thing that we see here is they had to fulfill all of the requirements. Now, one other thing that's worthy of note before we move on, what happens when they keep this Passover in the beginnings of the Promised Land? No more manna. All right. I've brought you to the land that flows with milk and honey. Now you've got to get out and scavenge and feed yourselves. And they did. And the manna stopped because God had fulfilled his promise to bring them there. They've arrived in that respect. Now, notice next, well, I don't know. We're going to have to work on that. Well, Eric or whoever's upstairs, would you? There we go. Now it's the second slide. All right. Notice next the angel of the Lord. In verses 13, 14, 15, Joshua is there by Jericho. Doesn't mean he's standing by the wall, but he's there where he can see it. Lifted up his eyes, looked, and behold, a man stood opposite him with his sword drawn in his hand. And Joshua went to him and said to him, "Are you for us or for our adversaries? Whose side are you on?" as it were. And he said, "No, but as commander of the army of the Lord, I have now come." And Joshua fell on his face to the earth and worshipped and said to him, "What does my Lord say to his servant?" Then the commander of the Lord's army said to Joshua, "Take your sandal off your foot, for the place where you stand is holy." And Joshua did so. Now that sounds an awful lot like something that happened about 40-something years before, doesn't it? Back there in Exodus, the burning bush. The angel of the Lord had spoken to Abraham back in Genesis chapter 22. In verses 15, 16, 17, 18, he said to Abraham, "By myself I have sworn, says the Lord, because you have done this thing and have not withheld your son, your only son. Blessing, I will bless you. Multiplying, I will multiply your descendants as the stars of the heaven, as the sand which is on the seashore. Your descendants shall possess the gate of their enemies. In your seed all the nations of the earth shall be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice." That's what he said to Abraham. Again in Exodus chapter 3 and verses 2 through 6 and verse 14. Now that's the burning bush. Moses at the burning bush. The angel of the Lord speaks to him there. And here's the point. In this moment, Joshua encounters the angel of the Lord. Now the word Lord is the word Yahweh, or we would maybe translate it as Jehovah in modern speech. And the word angel is captain or prince or commander of the army of the Lord. And this event, to Joshua's mind, knowing his history, this would recall to his thoughts what God had done with Abraham and the offering of Isaac, and what God had said to Moses at the burning bush, and the command that Joshua, take your shoes off, you're on holy ground. That highlights that point. It takes us back to Exodus chapter 3 and verse 5. God told Moses the same thing. Maybe Abraham was barefoot, I don't know. But the drawn sword here would recall the moment when the angel of the Lord, later on would recall the Lord when the moment when the Lord approaches Balaam, the angel of the Lord, over in Numbers chapter 22, verses 23 and 31. It would bring that instance to mind as well. The angel of the Lord was against Balaam there because he was trying to do wrong. Question: who's the angel of the Lord? That title appears 48 times in the Old Testament and 11 more times in the New Testament. And there is an important distinction between the Old Testament references and the New Testament references. In the Old Testament, it's always the angel of the Lord. In the New Testament, it's an angel of the Lord. There's one exception in the New Testament, and that's in Matthew chapter 1, verse 24. But grammatically, it's looking back to an angel of the Lord in verse 20. So we can't really make the comparison there between that and this. In Genesis 22, Abraham, and in Exodus chapter 3 with Moses, the angel of the Lord is identified with God. Generally believed, most commentators, scholars, Bible students generally believe that this is a reference to the pre-incarnate Christ, or in other words, a reference to the Son of God before he took human form. Partly because references to this angel by this title, the angel of the Lord, you don't find that in the New Testament. After Jesus takes on flesh, no more references like that. No more mention in that form. Now, can we draw that conclusion with absolute 100%, I know it beyond all shadow of a doubt certainty? Well, no. But it is a reasonable supposition. It is an understanding that does no violence to anything that the Bible teaches. And it offers us a little bit of insight into what is Jesus doing, as it were, before he takes on human form. We can go to John chapter 1 and read, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The same was in the beginning with God, and read down a little farther, and we find without him was not anything made that hath been made. So he was actively involved in the process of creating the physical universe. But between Genesis 3, basically, and Matthew 1, what is the Son of God doing? Well, this gives us a little insight into the relationship, the activity of one of the members of the Godhead. What is certain, even if we can't be 100% absolute sure about this, what is certain is that in the Old Testament, at various times, God spoke. God revealed himself as an angel or in angelic form to instruct his people. Notice Joshua's response in verse 14. Joshua fell on his face to the earth and worshiped and said to him, "What does my Lord say to his servant?" And there's no putting this off. Oh, no, don't you bow down and worship me. None of that, like we find later on in other circumstances. This would indicate that this is a manifestation of God. This is no ordinary angel. This is the Lord appearing as an angel. And you have precedent for that. Acts chapter 10, verse 26 makes reference to that. Revelation chapter 19 also, verse 10, and chapter 22, verse 9, and so forth. Think about it. On the road to Emmaus after the resurrection, Jesus encounters two disciples, but what do we discover? They don't know who they're talking to. They don't recognize him until he's ready for them to, and that's when he departs. He has that ability. So we've got the reference to the angel of the Lord, and the whole point is to show Joshua, if you're with me, if you're on my side, if you're doing what I'm doing, fulfilling my commandments, meeting my requirements, I'm with you. I'm on your side. So go on to the next point. And as we progress through Joshua chapter 5, now we've got instructions. We come into chapter 6, and this is where the instructions begin for Jericho. Jericho was securely shut up because of the children of Israel. None went out, none came in. The Lord said to Joshua, now listen to what the Lord says. See, look, I have given Jericho into your hand, its king and the mighty men of valor. You shall march around the city, all you men of war. You shall go all around the city once. This you shall do 6 days. 7 priests shall bear 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the ark. But the 7th day you shall march around the city 7 times, and the priests shall blow the trumpets. It shall come to pass when they've made a long blast with the ram's horn, and when you hear the sound of the trumpet, that all the people shall shout with a great shout. Then the wall of the city will fall down flat, and the people shall go up every man straight before him. That's the instruction. Go back to Genesis chapter 6 and 7, you read about God giving instructions to Noah. Noah, build a box, build a barge. Make it this long, this wide, this tall. Make it after this design. Build it out of this material. And it'll preserve you from the waters of the flood. Go to Exodus chapters 3 and 4. And there we read about God telling Moses his plan for delivering his people through Moses. Come to Judges. Jump ahead to Judges chapter 6 and 7. And there you have God's instructions to Gideon about dealing with the Midianites. How about jump over to the New Testament? Look at Matthew chapter 28, Mark chapter 16, Luke chapter 24, the Great Commission, the gospel message given to the apostles and to all Christians then. Instructions. God always gives instructions. God always has the plan in mind before he comes to us to disclose it. God doesn't do anything on the fly. He always prepares ahead of time. Now, there's a good lesson for us in that. But he also does not consult with us. Has God ever said to you, Jim, what do you think? It doesn't happen.